In this video, I'm going to be discussing the nature of authoritarianism. All right, we're going to be looking at how authoritarianism manifests itself into a society, and I'm also going to point out some other patterns that move in lockstep with the rise of authoritarianism. And in particular, we're going to look at how an economy functions, or rather, how an economy's function changes over time as authoritarian policies become more prevalent. And we're also going to look at how human behavior ties into this changing nature of authoritarianism. So, first, let's define authoritarianism. Authoritarianism is the enforcement or advocacy of strict obedience to authority at the expense of personal freedom. And this definition is straight from Oxford Dictionary, so if you have a problem with it, that's where I got it. But we can look at other definitions, and the same pattern will arise. Authoritarianism is basically a government or authority exerting control over people, and in effect, the people are losing personal freedom in the process. And that control exerts itself through both enforcement and advocacy, as stated in the definition. And the difference between those is that the enforcement is basically policy that's actually being enforced by the government, right? And advocacy could be considered a social movement that is, again, advocating for enforcement, even if there's not actual policy in the books yet. And at this point, I'm going to divide authoritarianism into two separate categories. Right? We're going to look at social authoritarianism. In other words, authoritarianism that seeks to control human behavior directly. You could think of this as like a speed limit or a drug law. And then we're going to look at economic authoritarianism. Right? These are economic policies that attempt to control human behavior indirectly. And an example of that would be something like tax code or welfare policies or something of that sort. Now, it's important to point out that there are already defined political economic models titled social authoritarianism and economic authoritarianism. That's not what I'm referring to here. We're just breaking the nature of authoritarianism, its nature to attempt to control human behavior. We're breaking that nature into two distinct categories. So in this video, when I refer to social authoritarianism, I'm actually referring to the ways in which social policies and social movements attempt to control human behavior. And when I'm referring to economic authoritarianism, I'm referring to ways in which economic policies and economic movements attempt to control that behavior. So let's circle back to the definition. Again, authoritarianism is the enforcement or advocacy of strict obedience to authority at the expense of personal freedom. So, in other words, authoritarian policies attempt to control human behavior, particularly radical human behavior that may encroach on the rights of other people. So, in the Declaration of Independence, for example, we are given the right to live, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So if somebody wanted to encroach on your right to live, it's beneficial to everyone in that society to create an authoritarian policy that it attaches a punishment to encroaching on someone else's right to live, okay, that in an attempt to deter that encroachment, right? This is how authoritarian policies work. Society collectively deems a behavior or an action as either immoral or destructive to society, and they outlaw it and they attach punishments to it in order to deter people from taking those actions. So what we're really seeing here with the nature of authoritarian policies is that people are attempting to control the behavior of others because they fear the actions they may take. So it benefits us to start a society or to start a community that attaches punishments to certain actions that society collectively deems as destructive. So what we can say is that authoritarian policies are actually a response to fear, and in effect, they're a function of fear. And now, what I'm going to lay out here are two categories of fear responses, okay? We have reactive and proactive fear responses, okay? Reactive responses are those real-time responses, okay? Spontaneous responses to control of fear. And an example of this could be a fight or flight response, right? And then we have proactive fear responses, okay? These are predetermined responses to control our fears. And because we're consciously thinking human beings, we can come up with more sophisticated fear responses than reactive fears, right? And again, an example of this are these social and economic authoritarian policies and movements that we are enacting and taking part in. And what I'm really trying to nail home here is the dynamic between fear and control, okay? If you fear something in your environment, you're going to seek control over that fear because you want to eliminate the fear, right? And if we are conscious thinking human beings, we can come up with proactive solutions rather than depend on reactive solutions. And in truth, even a fight or flight response is a way to control the fear. It's either you put distance between yourself and that which you fear, or you fight it, right? And there's a reason I'm pointing this out, okay? And it may not be clear now, and I will tie it back in, but this dichotomy between fighting your fears and running from them, that essentially encompasses all the possible solutions that we can come up with for a fear we may have. And this includes proactive solutions, okay? Any solution, proactive or reactive, that we come up with to control our fears, it's going to fall on this scale between effectively a fight or a flight response. We're either going to be fighting the problem, fighting the fear, or we're going to be running from it. But let's put that aside for now, and let's, again, we're going to look at social and economic authoritarianism, okay? And we're going to look at how those things are manifesting themselves in society today via policy, social movements, and behaviors. So in order to do this in the most unbiased way possible, I'm going to look at all sides, okay? And in order to do that, what we basically have to do is we have to look at ways that social and economic authoritarianism are both increasing and decreasing, okay? And by doing this, what we're actually going to uncover is the nature of fear in this country. We're going to uncover the manner in which fear is changing, okay? Because remember, again, authoritarian policies are a result of fear, okay? They're a proactive response to fear. And if we see a decrease in authoritarian policies, then the conclusion we can make is that people are becoming less fearful. And an increase would insinuate that people are becoming more fearful. So to start this process, let's look at the manner in which social authoritarianism is decreasing, okay? Now, what we're basically saying here is that we want to find ways that personal freedoms are increasing, okay? If we're looking for ways that social authoritarianism, okay, social controls are decreasing, then we're effectively looking at ways that personal freedom is increasing. Now, the most obvious example I have of this is marijuana laws, okay? We are legalizing marijuana state by state, recreationally and medically, slowly, right? It's not quick, but it is going in the direction of personal freedom. And it's important to recognize why this is, okay? If an authoritarian policy is a response to fear, then the reversal of an authoritarian policy, for example, the illegality of medical and recreational marijuana, then that's a response to an easing of that fear. In other words, people are just simply becoming less fearful of marijuana use. And at this point, I got to be honest with you, I'm kind of stumped. I don't have a very long list of significant examples of decreasing social authoritarian policies or movements. In other words, I don't have many examples of expanding personal freedom. Now, I do have one more example, okay? And it's not the greatest example, and I'll explain why, but basically we have some liberal cities and maybe even state governments. They're forgiving shoplifting, okay? They're not prosecuting shoplifters. And the reason I say this is a bad example is because I don't believe that these policies are necessarily causing a decrease in fear. In fact, I think they may be increasing fear. I mean, if you go shopping with your children, you don't want to see somebody run through the store with a mask on stealing stuff. Maybe they don't have violent intentions, but again, maybe they do, and you just don't know. And again, that's where the fear comes from. The fear comes from uncertainty. The fear comes from the lack of control. So When you enact a policy like this and you decide to announce it publicly, you're ringing the dinner bell for shoplifters, and in effect, you're increasing fear. And I'm not even saying that all shoplifting is bad, okay? If you're running out of the store with a box of spaghetti because you're struggling to feed your family, I'm writing you off as a victim of a broken economy. I'm not calling you a shoplifter. I'm calling you a person that is a victim to a broken economic structure. And I will get to the nature of that broken economic structure soon. Okay, it'll all tie back in. But if you're running out of a store stealing designer clothing and TVs, then there's a lot less of a chance that you're actually struggling to feed yourself. Okay, if you were struggling to feed yourself, you wouldn't be going through the trouble of stealing an expensive item and trying to sell it in order to buy yourself food. And again, this is the last example I have of decreasing social authoritarian policies and social movements. Okay, now there's probably other small examples, okay, but in reality, those examples are going to be insignificant compared to the other side of this list that I'm about to give you. Now, if you do have any other examples, feel free to comment them. Seriously, I could have easily overlooked something obvious, but again, we're going to move on to ways in which social authoritarianism is increasing. Now, I'm going to make a broad category here entitled censorship, okay? Because a lot of the ways that social authoritarian policies attempt to ease their fears are by censoring the speech of those they fear. Now, there's some parallels here between censorship and the First Amendment, but not all censorship is necessarily an infringement on the First Amendment, right? Because the Bill of Rights defines the First Amendment as protection from censorship by the government. So we're going to start with examples that don't actually infringe on the First Amendment, but rather just examples where people are trying to censor the speech of other people. And a lot of this occurs online, right? And that's how it sidesteps the First Amendment. And the first example I have here is cancel culture, okay? It's basically attempting to cancel the speech of somebody else or cancel their ability to make a living based on something they said or did in the past. And in that same light, we have all of these social media platforms that censor us, like Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, and they probably censor us for profit-driven reasons, right? But they may also be trying to control the narrative a little bit or a lot, right? And in effect, what this is it's a fight response. Okay, it's a response that attempts to diminish the ability of your opposition to talk. Okay, but how about another website, Reddit? Well, Reddit is basically a giant echo chamber. If you are trying to discuss anything controversial, it's basically a giant echo chamber. Now, this in effect is a flight response. Okay, it's people just attempting to hide from their opposition, and I don't know if the goal is to pretend they don't exist. And it's almost like a safe space, right? An echo chamber is a kind of akin to a safe space. We have safe spaces in universities and stuff. Again, it's like that's not actually solving the problem. That's just running from it. And I've got one more example of censorship that doesn't infringe on the First Amendment here, and that's it's this tendency for us to try to make certain racial slurs exclusive to certain races or cultures. Now, this is another flight response, right? You're hoping that by not hearing these words that racism diminishes, but the problem with that theory is that racism didn't begin because of a couple words, okay? The words were the result of the racism. And if you sit here, again, it's a flight response. If you sit here and run from the problem, it's not going to go away just because you're not hearing the words. In the same way that hiding in a safe space is not going to make the problem go away. And by extension, you're also ignoring the context of the words, right? If you take a word at its very basis, it's just a sound, and you're creating your own meaning out of that sound, even if it had no malicious intent. Okay, but now I'm going to look at some examples of censorship that actually do stem from the government. In other words, some examples of censorship that do infringe on the First Amendment. All right. Well, if you paid any attention to these Twitter files that Elon Musk leaked, it's pretty clear that the government was working with Twitter to ban or to censor speech. And if you do not think this is dangerous because Twitter was censoring the speech that you find harmful, well, what happens when something like the Restrict Act comes along? If you haven't heard of the Restrict Act, well, let's look a little deeper into this. It seems at first glance that this act is attempting to control TikTok. Okay, it's attempting to control China's influence over the American population via TikTok. But if you read a little deeper, it actually gives the executive branch of the government the ability to prosecute you as a foreign adversary based on what you say online. And the what that really means is that if you happen to gain influence and they don't like the influence that you have, they are going to prosecute you. And in effect, they are removing, or rather infringing on your First Amendment rights online. And it's not actually even constitutional. It's hard to say whether this bill will get passed, but there is bipartisan support. And that's the interesting thing about it. It seems to me that this government has gone rogue into these authoritarian tendencies. And I may make a video about the Restrict Act in the future. I'll have to actually dig into it a little deeper. But the overarching pattern, again, is that this is a direct infringement on your First Amendment rights. And another infringement by the government that we're seeing is some of these state governments. Okay, they're looking to ban books. Okay, they're trying to ban the teaching of CRT, critical race theory, in schools. Now, the critical race theory is a topic in itself, and maybe I'll make a video about that too. But it's basically a big debacle on the right that I don't even understand where it's coming from. It's critical race theory, and at its core, is literally just history, and people are trying to basically ban the teaching of history because it doesn't shed them in a favorable light. But let's look at some other ways that social authoritarianism is increasing. Okay, we have these abortion policies that are becoming increasingly more radical. We're having states call for the prosecution of people that leave their state to get an abortion. But what other social authoritarian policies have we had recently? Well, we have these vaccine and mask mandates, right? We had these lockdowns, and you could say that maybe some states with higher population densities are more susceptible to diseases like COVID, and maybe they're a little more necessary there. But we also have the government enforcing these vaccine mandates on their employees. And this one's particularly interesting to me because we already know the healthcare industry is messed up in this country, and yet we give these pharmaceutical companies billions of dollars to vaccinate the population, and then what happens? We censor anyone that tries to paint these vaccines in a bad light, and a lot of that censorship is coming coming from the public. It's not even coming from the government necessarily. And how about private prisons? We have one of the highest incarceration rates in the world, and yet we go around touting ourselves as the nation of democracy and freedom. Seems a little hypocritical, no? Is our incarceration rate so high because we are just a country full of criminals, or are the laws that define crime just corrupted? But how about Second Amendment rights? Well, we have these school shooters and shootings in general, mass shootings that seem to be like replicating. At least the media would want you to think so. And what happens? Well, obviously people are going to fear losing their child or losing their own life in a mass shooting, so they're going to call for authoritarian control over guns. They're going to call for a ban on assault weapons or whatever it may be. Now, this is the end of my list of manifestations of increasing social authoritarianism in the U.S. today. Now, I know for a fact there are other things I did not list here, and you're welcome to point those out, but I'm going to move on now to the manner in which economic authoritarianism is increasing. And now I'm going to start, the reason I'm starting with the way in which it's increasing will come full circle, but in short, economic authoritarianism is decreasing, okay? And we're going to start with the short list of ways that it's increasing. And the manner in which this happens is welfare, right? We have welfare programs, we have stimulus bills, among other things, right? We have food stamps, again, welfare programs. We attempt to redistribute wealth to diminish the effects of the growing wealth inequality. But again, the wealth inequality is still growing, okay? It's growing in response to these stimulus bills, okay? The inflation is increasing, overcorrecting even in response to these stimulus bills. So let's move on to the ways in which economic authoritarianism is decreasing, okay? And again, the first manner in which that occurs is rising wealth inequality. If we are not controlling the state of the economy, if we are not getting a hold of capitalism, then the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. This is the nature of capitalism. And I explain this in my video titled Inflation in Capitalistic Markets. But what are some other ways that economic authoritarianism is decreasing? Well, we have this corruption, right? We have this insider trading. We have the government working in conjunction with corporations and media in order to get what they want. There's a clip of Nancy Pelosi being asked about the insider trading that she's taken part in. You know, she says something like it's a free market, right? Like as if she is actually obeying the laws of the free market. She knows what she's doing, even if she doesn't say it out loud. Your intuition tells you that she knows she is cheating the market. Okay, and how about the lobbying, right? We have these lobbyists, Citizens United. Okay, our politicians are being paid off by large corporations to vote in a manner that is conducive to the profits of those large corporations. And one way that manifests itself is by these corporate bailouts, like, for example, in 2008, and these PPP loans in response to COVID even. And how else, though? How else is economic authoritarianism decreasing? Well, we have wage stagnation, okay? And again, wage stagnation is going to occur in any economy with increasing wealth inequality, right? It's kind of comes along with it. But how else? Well, we have this union busting going on. These union busting stories you hear out of Amazon and Starbucks, where they're effectively subverting the laborers' ability to organize for their own benefit. Okay, and meanwhile, Jeff Bezos is just, his net worth is just flying through the roof. It seems pretty obvious that there's some labor exploitation going on that Amazon and Starbucks and everyone else would like to keep under wraps, right? But how about another example? Employer-provided healthcare. Now, those people who provide the skilled labor to these companies, like the engineers, the doctors, right? The educated laborers who also have experience. These are the people who are protected by their employers with good benefits, with good pay, right? But it's not those people who are abundant. The people who are abundant are the unskilled laborers, okay? The people without tons of experience, okay? The people who don't have a college degree, or anyone else that these corporations can convince or fool into accepting low benefits and low pay. As they would happily pay engineers half their salary if they would accept it, right? So at this point, let's step back and look at these examples of economic and social authoritarianism that we have. And what we're going to do is we're going to identify who the victims and the beneficiaries are of these social and economic authoritarian policies and behaviors. So if we look back at censorship,
we have cancel culture. Well, who benefits from cancel culture? Well, the left is largely the group that's canceling people, right? And they're honestly canceling the right more often than not. So I will say that cancel culture is mostly beneficial to the left and mostly victimizes the right. Now, how about online speech censorship? Well, again, this is mostly victimizing the right, and it's mostly coming from the left, right? The left is kind of has a little bit more control over the internet than the right does, especially on websites like Reddit, YouTube, Twitter, And so, how about the safe spaces? Again, these don't necessarily even victimize the right. They kind of just benefit the left again, or so they think. It kind of it's a safe space, right? And the same concept applies to these race exclusive words, right? They're attempting to create a safe space, and in effect, it's another flight response, right? It's not actually fixing anything. It's just hiding from the problem. But how about government censorship? But how about the government's infringements on the First Amendment? Well, the only people that benefit from First Amendment infringement is the government. The left and right can both be victimized by something like the Restrict Act, or less directly via something like the Twitter files, where the government is working with a social media company to censor speech. Okay, and how about the book bans? Okay, again, this generally is coming from is generally benefiting the right, or so they think. Again, and it's victimizing the left. Okay, but it's not actually solving any problems. It's just increasing the strife between the left and right. But how about abortion bans? Obviously, that's a movement largely coming from the right and victimizing the left. And the vaccine and mask mandates, along with the lockdowns, are all examples of mainly the left trying to victimize the right, or rather, the left trying to victimize themselves and control the right to ease their fears of the effects that a uncooperative right wing might have on the effects of COVID. So, how about private prisons? Who benefits from private prisons? Well, I really don't think the right or left benefits in particular. I think who benefits is the private prison owners, the people that are profiting from the insane incarceration rate. All right, and maybe the drug war a little bit as well too, and maybe the drug war affects the left a little more, but there are plenty of right and left wing people in prison.
And lastly, who are the beneficiaries and victims of these attempts to ban firearms? Well, again, this movement's coming mostly from the left, and obviously there are plenty of lefties who support the Second Amendment, but again, mostly coming from the left, and they're mostly victimizing the right. And the people on the left that are trying to ban these firearms, they would probably argue that firearm bans benefit everybody. That's an interesting argument, and we'll come back to it. Just keep it in the back of your mind. So now let's look at the beneficiaries and victims of our examples of decreasing social authoritarianism. Again, the ways in which social freedoms are actually increasing. So first, marijuana laws. Who's the beneficiary of that? Well, everyone, obviously. Whether or not you use marijuana, it's a social freedom that doesn't infringe on anyone else's rights. So everyone's a beneficiary, and by extension, there's really no victims. And regarding the policies that decriminalize shoplifting, who are the beneficiaries there? Well, the only beneficiaries are the thieves, and the victims are pretty much everyone else via the increasing fear, right? But let's move on to the ways in which economic authoritarianism is decreasing. Okay, let's identify the beneficiaries of these examples. Well, who's the beneficiary of wealth inequality? Well, obviously the rich people, right? And how about corruption? Who's the beneficiary of that? Again, the people who are participating in the corruption. Okay, the rich people, the people in power, the Nancy Pelosi's of the world, right? Who's benefiting from the lobbying? Again, the rich people that own these corporations.
Who benefits from the corporate bailouts? Certainly not everyday people. It's the owners. It's the people who own this country. Okay, wage stagnation. Certainly not the lower class benefiting from that. Again, it's all of these things. If you look at the union busting, employer provided health care, they're all benefiting the upper class. And by extension, who are the victims? Well, the victims are the lower class in all of these cases. And again, we'll quickly touch on the beneficiaries of the increasing economic authoritarian policies like welfare and stimulus bills. Again, these do benefit poor people, right? But again, the wealth inequality is getting worse, so they're not doing a very good job of benefiting the lower class. And as far as the victims go, if you look at welfare, assuming that welfare is coming from tax money, it's being siphoned from the upper class, then you could consider the upper class a victim. And regarding the stimulus bills, well, we know that's not being siphoned from tax dollars. It's being printed, all right? The source is the printer again, so the victim there is nobody. And again, to even call the upper class a victim of welfare policies, it's a bit of a stretch because the wealth inequality is still increasing. So it's a bit of a fallacy to say that they are victims. It's because, in effect, the welfare policies are not redistributing wealth effectively. But I'll leave them in there as a victim. We'll give them one loss at least. Now, let's go back to these examples of how social authoritarianism is increasing. Again, we have this list of censorship and these Second Amendment rights along with these other oddballs. What is the pattern here? Well, the pattern is that both the left and right are victims and beneficiaries of these social authoritarian policies and behaviors. Okay? Now, why might this be? Again, remember the dynamic between fear and control that we pointed out at the beginning of this video. When someone fears something or someone, they seek to control them. So how does the public control their fears of their opposition? How does the left control the right and the right control the left? Well, they create these social authoritarian policies and social movements in an attempt to control the behavior of their opposition. This is how all of these calls for social authoritarianism manifest themselves, okay? We have the left and right who fear each other so much that they're effectively playing authoritarian leapfrog. Every time the left creates an authoritarian policy or social movement that infringes on the freedom of the right responds in kind. And I'm not saying the left started this, okay? The cycle starts, and it's a vicious cycle from then on out. Whoever the original perpetrator was, it really doesn't matter. All that matters is that the overall pattern is increasing fear and accompanying increasing calls for control of the opposition. So in reality, neither the right nor the left are benefiting from this game of authoritarian leapfrog, okay, from these increasing authoritarian policies and movements. It's a zero-sum game, except both the left and right are losing personal freedom as they seek to control each other. So who's left to balance the zero-sum game back to zero? Well, again, who's the beneficiary of the increase of the social authoritarian policies and movements? It's the upper class, all right? It's the owners. It's the corporations, okay? And so what do? Well, in any way they can, they are happy to oblige all of these calls for social authoritarianism. Why? Well, because it helps them control the population better. It helps them control their finances better. And the pattern that you have to recognize here is that the left and right are both victims of class warfare. There's plenty of people on the left and right that belong to the lower and middle class who are victims of these authoritarian policies. Now, again, it all stems from fear. Whoever you fear is who you are going to try to control. Whatever you fear is what you are going to try to control. This is the basis of the divide and conquer strategy. You use people's emotions and you turn them against each other so that they will seek to control each other. And then who benefits? Oh, the people in power benefit. The upper class benefits. And they orchestrated the entire thing. Now, I'm not saying it was necessarily a conscious orchestration the entire time. Okay, there's a lot of people who believe that abortion is evil, and the truth is it's not a black and white issue. But you have to realize why abortions are on the rise. It's not because the devil has infiltrated the minds of the youth or some other religious nonsense. It's because we are failing to create an economy that can support children. All right, this is a very simple concept to understand. Our DNA has been evolving for thousands, if not millions of years. I mean, we are descendants of dinosaurs. Okay, our DNA knows when an environment is not capable of sustaining children, and the result of that is that we will have less children. The reason the birth rate is dropping worldwide, mind you, is because people fear for their ability to provide for the children and by extension for themselves. And that fear doesn't just cause abortion, right? It causes people to seek control over those things that they fear. So the first requirement for a divide and conquer strategy is resource scarcity. Now, that scarcity may be orchestrated, or maybe it's not, or maybe the truth is the level of orchestration of that scarcity varies over time, depending on the particular scenario. And step two, in lockstep with the scarcity, is fear. All right, scarcity leads to fear. Okay, and again, in lockstep, step three, fear leads people to seek control over those fears. Okay, so when they seek control, when they look for that proactive solution to their fear, who are they going to blame for the fear? Who are they going to blame for the scarcity? They're going to blame whoever they are taught to blame. They're going to fear whoever they are taught to fear. And I did a deep dive into this concept in a different video, but in essence, whatever you are taught is the summation of your perception. Okay, all the inputs that go into your brain is what you are. That creates your perception. So where do people get their perception from? Well, we are increasingly using technology. Okay, we're increasingly using media, whether it's reading, watching videos, listening to people. We are increasingly using media to create our perception. So by definition, the mainstream media has predominant control of that public perception. That's why they've earned the title mainstream. And it's not to say that there aren't smart people out there who don't fall victim to the messages that the media sends. But in all likelihood, if they're not listening to Fox News and CNN, they're probably distracting themselves in one of the other 1.5 million ways we have nowadays with all of our technology. And I personally have fallen victim to that for a good 27 years. So let's tie back into that definition of authoritarianism, okay? Again, authoritarianism is the enforcement or advocacy of strict obedience to authority at the expense of personal freedom. So if we look at these examples we provided of increasing social authoritarianism, we can determine that our personal freedoms are being diminished, okay? And they're being diminished because the left and right fear each other, wrongfully so. And in effect, they're trying to control each other. They're playing a game of authoritarian leapfrog. And it's a very dangerous game, okay? This is the game that nations play right before they collapse into oligarchy or fascism. I mean, you could argue that the United States is already an oligarchy, and you would have a pretty easy time winning that debate. So, in reality, and I'm going to edit this chart a little bit here, the left and right are all victims of these social authoritarian policies, and the only people that are benefiting are the upper class. Again, the owners of these large corporations and the media and the higher-ups in the government that are in bed with them. So if you recognize the pattern here, social authoritarianism is increasing and economic authoritarianism is decreasing, okay? This isn't just a pattern. This is a causal relationship, okay? As economic authoritarianism decreases, social authoritarianism will increase, okay? Social authoritarianism is an inverse function of economic authoritarianism. So, in other words, as economic authoritarianism decreases, social authoritarianism will increase in response to the fear created by the wealth inequality that results from the lack of economic authoritarianism. This is the nature of inequality, okay? This is what inequality does. It leads to fear, and fear leads to attempts to control. This leads to more fear. It leads to anger. It leads to violence, okay? These are fundamental human emotions that capitalists have historically been very good at exploiting. And the problem here is that there's a ton of people who look at the technological innovations that capitalism has led to, and they say, well, obviously capitalism is better than socialism, right? There's no way that a socialistic economy could have come up with these things. And the interesting thing about that argument is they might be right, and the truth is we'll never know. But what is true is that it's not working now, okay? The system is dying. We are literally not replacing our population because our DNA is telling us not to have children, okay? Our economy is based on infinite growth. If we stop replacing our population, then that infinite growth cannot be sustained. And that's actually an interesting topic for why Biden's border policies are what they are. The American population is not having children at the rates that is needed to keep up with the other economies in this world. So what do? Well, they're going to let all those people through the border because they want that cheap labor, all right? No matter what they say on Fox News and CNN, they want that cheap labor in this country so they can exploit it. That's how capitalism works. So let's talk about some solutions to this problem. Not the border, but to this increasing social authoritarianism. Well, we already identified that the increase in social authoritarian policies and social movements, they are an inverse function of the lack of economic authoritarianism, right? They're an inverse function of our unwillingness to properly address the wealth inequality. So all we have to do is increase the economic authoritarianism. All we have to do is reduce the wealth inequality. And again, I already pointed out that we have these stimulus bills and this welfare. Like, we have some half-assed attempts at doing so. But again, the wealth inequality is still getting worse. So obviously it's not working. And the reason it's not working is because when we print money without value creation, all it does is inflate the currency, because the good capitalists that control the prices, they're just going to raise the prices accordingly to the money supply. And why wouldn't they? That's the nature of capitalism. You have to eat or be eaten, right? So the solution is to redistribute existing wealth. If you keep trying to print new money, the people at the top are just going to keep raising the prices. And in effect, your wages are going to drop and relevant to those prices, and your buying power is going to end up right back where it was. Now, the problem with simply redistributing existing wealth is that when you raise the taxes on these rich people, they're just going to raise the prices again in response, because they're going to do anything they can to make up for their losses. And so, unfortunately, the only solution to that problem is to implement price controls. And at this point, you are treading into communistic territory. And that's the unfortunate end game of capitalism, is a communistic revolution. Okay, this is what Marx predicted, and the reason he knew this was because he understood that the instinctual human greed, if not controlled, would lead to wealth inequality at a level that does not provide necessities for the lower and even middle class. Okay, at a certain point, they all become the lower class. But what's the problem with implementing price controls? Right? What's the problem with this communistic economic approach? Well, again, we addressed the corruption in the government, right? We already concluded that the government and the media and these large corporations are in bed with each other. What implication does this corruption have on the implementation of price controls? In all likelihood, the government's just going to rig the entire economy in their favor again, right? So they can't be counted on to make these changes, right? This brings up an interesting dichotomy between communism and socialism, okay? So what's the difference between communism and socialism? Well, communism creates equality through state-led authoritarian controls, whereas socialism creates equality through a democratically elected government. All right, the difference between communism and socialism is very, very nuanced. All right, pay close attention here. The difference between the two is the magnitude of authoritarianism that exists in the economy prior to the transition to either communism or socialism. In other words, communism develops from an already propagandized and fearful population, a population like that of the United States right now, where the propagation of fear in the media has already led to a significant rise in social authoritarian policies and movements. Socialism, on the other hand, arises from a population that is free and educated, all right? A population that has not fallen victim to excessive fear propagation and the accompanying social authoritarian policies and movements. And in effect, communism is the top-down solution to the end stage of capitalism, where an existing corrupted government attempts to create equality to sustain itself. And this is kind of the way that China and Russia function. I mean, if you look at the social freedoms that these countries have, I mean, the United States still kind of outpaces them so far, right? Whereas socialism is the bottom-up solution, okay? It's the solution led by the lower and middle class that takes control of their government before the corruption takes control of their social freedoms. So if you are a person that has fallen victim to the fear propagation in the media, you might have a hard time understanding the difference between socialism and communism. And this is because the media has made you so fearful that you are literally working for their cause, and their cause is to tell you that socialism and communism are the same thing, and they're both evil. And the thing is there is a possibility we could implement temporary price controls in this transition. If, for example, we were to elect a president like FDR, FDR changed the entire structure of the U.S. economy in order to save the country from the Great Depression, and in conjunction with World War II, right? But even when we came out of World War II, we had a couple decades of economic equality, all right? We had a couple decades where the economy was working for the lower and middle class. And I expect that was because the lower and middle class were empowered, okay? Even without the price controls. But what happened? Well, over time, and perhaps with the help of the adoption of radios and television and the expansion of mainstream media, the public became more fearful, the public became more divided, and before long, we elect a president like Reagan who completely flips our tax policy on its head. And ever since then, what's happened? We've had rising wealth inequality. We've had rising diseases of despair. And we can't figure this out because, again, the media is in control. So I'm going to retouch on this concept of necessity really quick. When an economy does not provide necessities for the laborers, that economy will collapse, okay? It will either revolt peacefully or otherwise, okay? JFK told us this. And the thing you have to remember here is that this fear, this dynamic between fear and control, it is causing an increase in authoritarianism. So let's look back at these examples of increasing social authoritarianism.
Now, why do you think there are so many attacks on the First Amendment in particular, censorship, and also the Second Amendment? Well, the First Amendment isn't just the freedom to speech, right? The First Amendment is the freedom of collective perception itself. Our perception is everything that we are. It is the foundation of whatever your individual view of reality is. It follows that in order to control collective perception, you must first diminish those perceptions that challenge your own. You must censor the speech that you don't like. And this is why there's all these calls for censorship. Right? Our perception is created by our communication or by our speech. As we increasingly communicate with technology, we hand more and more control over our perception to whoever controls the technology. And these media platforms, they don't solely control your perception with speech censorship, right? They also control what speech you see on these platforms. And by extension, they control the narrative. So even if they're not necessarily censoring you, they're showing you what they want to show you. So even if a social media platform isn't necessarily censoring you, they are controlling your perception by controlling what speech you see. And media in general controls what speech you see, right? But there's an important distinction to point out here between social media versus like general media. Okay, social media still allows for two-way communication, right? It allows you to ask questions and challenge opinions. Even if some of that speech is censored, it still does allow for some level of communication. On the other hand, general media removes that two-way communication, right? It removes the ability to ask questions or to challenge the narrative that's being put forth. This is a very unnatural way for humans to learn. All right, the difference between a political conversation with your family and a CNN or Fox News segment is huge. All right? Without conversation, you're basically being programmed. If you're watching the mainstream media platforms and you find that you're not questioning anything that they're saying, you might as well just take your brain out of your head and mail it straight to Sean Hannity. I mean, you have to conversate. You have to. If you don't conversate, you're only learning what they want you to learn. And again, what about the challenges to the Second Amendment? Why are those significant? Well, what happens if we lose our gun rights? What happens if we lose our ability to defend ourselves against a government that is becoming increasingly tyrannical? The only logical conclusion is that we devolve into a fascist oligarchy. Okay, maybe it's one dictator, maybe it's a handful of them. Who cares? It's not going to be you. So it's kind of interesting that these founding fathers, who were at least partly morally corrupt in the sense that they didn't quite identify the hypocrisy of slavery and its confliction with the Declaration of Independence. It's interesting that these the first two amendments in the U.S. Bill of Rights are the freedom of speech and the right to own a gun, right? The right to bear arms. It's these first two amendments that are predominantly being attacked by our own population via this dynamic between fear and control. Okay, so in conclusion, I'm just going to sum up this video a little bit, all right? So we observe that as economic authoritarianism decreases, this causes wealth inequality, and the eventual result of the wealth inequality is that the wealthy people are able to purchase or control human perception, okay? And they do this by controlling the media. They purchase the media. And if you fall victim to the perception that they want you to fall victim to, you will become part of the problem. You will become a fearful individual that seeks to control other people. And the means by which you control other people will backfire on you, okay? It will lead to your opposition attempting to control you. This is, in effect, radicalism breeding radicalism, okay? If you have the left and right continuously trying to outdo each other, to outdo the control they have over each other, it will lead, by definition, to increasing authoritarianism.
And in effect, what's happening is the Overton window is expanding in both directions. Okay, it's going both left and right. And the thing about the left is that as the left goes farther left, it eventually does reach communism from an economic standpoint. But if the fear has created so much social authoritarianism in the process of reaching that communistic economic approach, then the society is going to devolve into fascism either way.
And this is the difference between communism and socialism that I pointed out earlier. The reason there are so many failed communist states, or states that call themselves communists but don't have tons of personal freedom, is because they're run by oligarchs to keep all the money for themselves. And this is the direction the U.S. is headed in.
So what happens as this Overton window expands, radicalism effectively breeds more radicalism, right? It's a vicious cycle. And it's a vicious cycle because the media on both sides is going to constantly remind you of the how radical the opposition is. CNN and Fox News aren't highlighting their moderate opposition. That doesn't do them any good. That doesn't get them any clicks. What they're doing is they're highlighting the most radical opposition that they can, and in effect, they're making you as fearful as possible, which will lead to you attempting to control that opposition.
And again, the overall pattern is that as this process plays out, as this divide and conquer strategy plays out, the wealth inequality is increasing during the entire process, as is the social authoritarian policies and movements. And to retouch on the solutions, okay, first and foremost, the solution starts with you, all right? It starts by taking control of your own perception, and by extension, diminishing the control that the mainstream media has over collective perception. Right? You need to look to alternative media sources with a particular set of characteristics, okay? You need to find media sources that aren't controlled by large corporations, that aren't funded by large corporations, or that aren't large corporations themselves. You need to find media sources that don't propagate fear between the left and the right. Find media sources that don't propagate fear among the middle and lower class. Right? Again, the solution starts with the individual. You need to become more conscious of where your fears are coming from, in addition to removing the distractions in your life that make you part of the problem. And the second step is to help those around you to do the same. All right, talk to people face to face and help them deconstruct the source of their fears that they've been led into. Right, help them understand the underlying catalyst of all of it that is the wealth inequality. If you manage to do these two steps successfully, all the other issues will fix themselves because people will see who their real enemy is, right? Uncovering the catalyst of these fears that is the wealth inequality will lead to more economic authoritarianism, and by extension, social authoritarian policies and movements will diminish, okay? Personal freedoms will increase. Fear will decrease. Fear among the middle and lower class. This solution starts with individual behavior, okay? Individual actions. It's the individual actions that make up the whole. If you tell yourself that I'm just one person, I can't do anything to fix this problem, then you manifest that into reality, okay? Because other people do the same, and before you know it, 9/10 of the population aren't trying to fix the problem. And I'll add that if you find you have been isolating more and more and reaching out less, you are going in the wrong direction, okay? And the reason you feel this way is understandable, okay? The reason people feel this strong disgust for the government and these vaccine mandates, it's understandable. The reason people are looking for safe spaces is understandable, all right? These are all responses to fear. But if we keep going down this path collectively, we will collectively collapse, all right? Together we stand, divided we fall. There's a well-known quote, right? Possession is 9/10 of the law. It might seem like people that have all the money and assets are the ones that possess everything, but the true nature of possession lies in the labor capacity, all right? The everyday middle and lower class citizens own the 9/10. It might be closer to 99/100, right? You and me effectively own 99% of everything. We just have to realize it. We just have to stop being distracted by the mainstream media.
And another thing I'll add is that it's very hard to get this message across to older people. It's very hard to change their thought patterns that they've been practicing over and over for decades. I'm 28 years old. Right, this message is not necessarily difficult to get across to young people, but it is important to give to them because they may they may fall into the same traps that the older people that are perhaps too far gone now to fix them. And it's kind of a sad reality, but the truth is the younger people are the future. As time goes on, the younger people are going to be the voting bloc, and that's the portion of the population that matters. I've tried to speak to older people in my own family, and not even that old, like 50s, 60s. That my parents, they don't have the interest, they don't have the drive because they're approaching retirement, or they're retired, or they just, again, they're just so far they've just been indoctrinated for so long that they can't change their minds. And that's just how time goes, and it's unfortunate, but that's why I would like to address mainly young people and middle-aged people as well, because they're going to be around long for a little while longer too. And if you are an older person and this message resonates with you, you have a special job in this process, because older people look at people like me and they think I'm naive, or I don't understand the way the world works. And it's understandable. Again, they've been living in a certain manner their entire lives. But if an older person describes this to them, if they help get the message to them, older people trust the intuition of older people more so than younger people, usually. And again, if you're an older person and this resonates with you, I asking for your help. And the thing about older people is that for a lot of them, I mean, the system is still working for them, right? I mean, they are the beneficiaries of it because they're the ones that brought it up. So they can't really see that it's not working for everybody, even though, again, all this social strife is getting worse. It's all a pattern. It's all a function of the wealth inequality. And that's why I make hour-long videos trying to break down these patterns in society that we're seeing. Okay, it's because a lot of people don't see them. A lot of people are distracted, or they're just, their heads are buried in the dirt. And me personally, I didn't grow up poor. I grew up in a middle upper class household. All right, I had plenty of privileges, and that luxury is what's allowed me to be able to spread this message. I feel like I have a responsibility to do so. If I don't, who else is going to? It's people like me that have the capacity to do so. And that's certainly not to say that I have been successful. Obviously, I'm not the biggest channel on YouTube, but I'm trying to get the message across that if you have as much of a role to play as me and all the YouTube channels that have 5 million subscribers, you have to play your role as I do, and I'm encouraging you to do so.
This is the path to a utopia, but if we aren't careful, it's the path to a very violent revolution. And that brings up another topic entirely. Okay, I mean, the US dollar is almost solely being held up by the US military. Okay, if we didn't have military bases around the world, 600, 800 of them or whatever it is, we wouldn't be able to get away with what we do with our currency, with the inflation, with the printing of new valueless money. We wouldn't be able to get away with it. And the problem is that as the social strife in our own country keeps rising, okay, as the wealth inequality keeps rising, what happens in order to defend our currency against collapse is that we have to literally manufacture social strife in other countries in order to keep the US dollar on top.
And what are some ways that the US does that? Well, through this imperialistic machine, right? Through this military-industrial complex. And we've been involved in more wars and regime changes than perhaps any nation in recent existence. Just look at the sanctions we put on nations that don't obey our attempts to spread democracy and freedom. I mean, look at what we did to Venezuela. And who do you think destroyed the Nord Stream pipelines? Do you think it was Russia, or do you think it was the U.S.? Why would Russia destroy something that was benefiting them? It doesn't make any sense. Seymour Hersh seems to think it was the U.S. And I believe him on account of the fact that our own senile president pretty much admitted it. It seems that Biden can't even like keep straight what is supposed to be confidential information and what is supposed to be public. The U.S. is basically using its military in conjunction with other covert operations to control the economic and social state of the rest of the world. It's a pretty convincing way to support your argument for capitalism if you can just go around the world bullying any nations that dare prove that socialism or communism is viable, right? And for the past several decades, past half a century or more, this has been really unfortunate for the rest of the nations in the world. The U.S. government and the corporations that both originate in the U.S. and globalize, they don't care what happens to Europe. They don't care what happens to Canada. They don't care what happens to China, Russia. They definitely don't care what happens to Africa. I mean, this facade is being held up by the military, and if the U.S. dollar collapses, the facade will collapse in a mere decade or less. And as the social strife in the U.S. gets worse, and as globalization increases, as these corporations globalize, what happens is the U.S. gets left behind, and in effect, these globalized corporations just become bullies to the entire world. The military-industrial complex will end up ruling the entire world at the expense of all of the people in it. And I'm going to make another video diving much deeper into this globalization topic, but this is a little precursor to it. It's this concept that the U.S. imperialists will become world imperialists. But again, in conclusion, just be careful where your perception is sourced, okay? Be careful of what media sources you use to construct your view of the world. If you are not careful, you will fall victim to the many nefarious sources that are out there, okay? The goal of these nefarious sources is to divide you so that they can conquer you. Now, that's not to say that every social authoritarian policy is bad, okay? There is some nuance here, as there is in everything. Remember, in the beginning of this video, we pointed out that the Declaration of Independence protects the right to live, okay? That is a social authoritarian policy. Now, the difference between a policy that protects the right to live and these policies that infringe on the First and Second Amendments is the golden rule. The difference is that by protecting the right to live, you are treating others the way you want to be treated. Whereas the end result of this First and Second Amendment infringement is the exact opposite of that. They're breaking the golden rule. We are increasingly treating our fake opposition the way we don't want to be treated, and they're responding in kind. This is detrimental to our personal freedoms in the long term. Or in all reality, in the short to medium term. This game of authoritarian leapfrog is accelerating very quickly, and many personal freedoms are already being affected, even if you haven't personally been affected yet. I can assure you that time is coming if we don't get a hold of our perceptions. And to bring back that passage in the Declaration of Independence one more time, I'll read this out. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Okay, so these social authoritarian policies are infringing on our right to liberty and our pursuit of happiness. And those are the only things standing between the government and your right to live. And the manner in which they did it was manufacturing consent from the governed by taking control of your perception in the media. the important thing to recognize here is that perception is just what we learn. Okay, your perception is all the inputs that went into your brain from the minute you were born till this moment. We are only as good as our sources, right? Your perception can be changed drastically and quickly. I've experienced this myself, okay, and a lot of other people have too. We need to make that change happen before it's forced upon us by what will potentially be violence. And I'm not some person that's known to be a doomsday prepper or anything like that, but I do recognize patterns, and I'm pretty good at it, and I feel obligated to share the patterns that I recognize with you. And by extension, I think you have an obligation to share the patterns that you find enlightening as well. And the last pattern I'll recognize here is that the divide and conquer strategies that have been used throughout history, there's a third step that everyone leaves out, okay? The full cycle is divide, conquer, and reset, okay? And if you don't recognize the fact that divide and conquer strategies lead to resets, then you need to look closer at history, because the warning signs are everywhere. Ancient Rome is a great place to start. So if you enjoyed this video, I appreciate your time. If you have any thoughts, short or very, very long, in-depth thoughts, please share them. I enjoy long, deep conversations. I don't participate in small talk very often, because I don't appreciate when people diminish the importance of the hard discussions that so many people want to avoid.
And in lockstep with that, we are losing our attention spans, especially among young people. We're constantly being pushed towards instant gratification. The number of people willing to sit through a 70-minute lecture is diminishing. And the problem with that is I don't think you can adequately represent what's going on in a 60-second YouTube short. And if I could do it in even a 10-minute video, I would. But again, it's very difficult. And if I do manage to create a following here on this channel, I will be starting a podcast of sorts where I speak to everyday people, primarily everyday people. That's the goal here. So again, thank you.